Hello everyone, I'm Yihao from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Today, I will be presenting the paper on the effect of strong azimuthal swirl on ignition and light around in an annular combustor. This is a work performed in collaboration with our French partners Safran Helicopter Engines and Cefex under the Annular program, which is a Marie Curie project funded by the European Union. In this presentation, we'll start off by introducing the experimental setup of the laboratory scale combustor used in our study, followed by the characteristic ignition time in an annular combustor known as the light around time. Then we'll be discussing about the light around sequence through the use of ignition maps as shown over here. And finally, on the impact of azimuthal staging on ignition dynamics. As a start, we know that gas turbines have multiple burners or injectors arranged in an annular fashion for compactness. However, there have not been many studies on the ignition dynamics in such an annular configuration. And so far, studies have not considered the more complex combustor design owing to the difficulty involved. For instance, the introduction of a net azimuthal flow in combustors has gained interest in recent years and proven to be an interesting concept because 1. The symmetry breaking enhances the combustor stability, and 2. A dominant flame propagation direction may reduce the ignition delay between injectors. To reduce NOx emissions, combustors have also been designed to operate under rich quench lean, otherwise known as RQL conditions. To this effect, in this study, ignition experiments have been performed on test bed which incorporates saline features of the Safran Ahano helicopter engine. Notably, 1. The injectors produce a strong azimuthal swirl around the annulus chamber. 2. The combustor operates in a rich quench lean RQL mode. And lastly, it allows fewer mass flow flexibility for azimuthal staging. And right now, we'll proceed to describe some of the geometric aspects of the lab scale combustor developed at our NTNU laboratory. In the setup shown here, we see the three main features of the combustor as mentioned earlier. 1. The anchored injectors to direct flames azimuthally, and the dilution ports located along the inner combustor wall, as well as an effusion-cooled backplane to realize the rich quench-lean operation mode. Speaking of the RQL mode, the combustor works in the following way. A fuel rich premixed is first ejected from the anchored injectors. So the equivalence ratio of the flame exiting the injector is more than 1. Then it is rapidly mixed with the cooling air from the effusion backplane, and then quenched by a high air mass flow rate from the dilution ports. So it is eventually operating at a global equivalence ratio 5G of less than 1. In our current study, the air mass flow split between the injectors, effusion backplane, and the dilution ports is kept constant. Diagnostics-wise, two high-speed cameras operating at 10 kHz are used to capture the fast transient process of the ignition light around. One gives a side view, and the other provides a global overhead annulus image, which is possible via reflection through an air-cooled mirror placed downstream of the combustor. Photomultipliers are also used to capture the flame dynamics, and these photomultipliers are positioned circumferentially at each of the 6 injectors, labeled I1 to I6, to detect the onset of flames during the ignition process at a much higher frequency compared to the usual high-speed imaging. And this table summarizes the operating conditions in this study. Bulk velocities, U injector, are varied, and so are the equivalence ratio. As mentioned earlier, we have phi injector, which refers to the equivalence ratio of the injector prior to quenching, and so is much richer than 1. And phi G, G for global equivalence ratio after quenching, which is of course much leaner. 2 different points of equivalence ratio were actually considered. One at a fixed global ratio of 0.7, underlined in red, and the other underlined in blue, which is the lowest possible ratio whereby successful ignition could always be achieved, which is dependent on the operating condition. As mentioned earlier, we have kept the air mass flow splits between the injectors, the dilution pods, and the effusion cooled backplane to be constant for all cases, as shown here. And over here, we can see a clip of the spinning flames orientated in an azimuthal direction. And on the right, we see the time-averaged flame images. The overhead image shows long jet flames are produced that impinge on the inner annular wall and reach the next injector. Adjacent flames are almost, if not fully connected, forming a pseudo-continuous flame arc. And for the side image, we see that the flame is directly interacting with the dilution air coming through the dilution pods, shown here as white circles, and being mixed with air for lean staging. Moving on, we will be looking at the light around time, tau ignition. And tau ignition basically characterizes the time delay for flame-to-flame propagation between the injectors. So first, in this video, we will see that I1 is the first injector to be ignited, and the ignition proceeds in an anti-clockwise sequence. So based on the PMT signals, we define it to be the time interval between the first and the last PMT that detects 10% of the maximum OH star intensity in the respective injector sector. So in this case, that will be at position I1 with the yellow plot and position I6, which is the black plot. Given the stochastic nature, we repeat each operating point at least 10 times to achieve some form of a statistical measure. From there, we fit a Gaussian distribution to obtain an estimate of the probability density function, PDF, for the mean light around time. And we have also included the light around time for each individual run shown as scatter plots here. To compare the effect of a strong azimuthal swirl, we have also included the data points of a reference case, in which we have simply straight axial injectors, without a band to direct flames in the azimuthal direction. And these plots are plotted in yellow. And when we are comparing points with the same global equivalence ratio, that is if we look at the red and the yellow plots, the azimuthal bulk swirl decreases light around time by about 15 to 30%. So it is evident that the bias flow favors a faster flame propagation around the annulus. And that in this study, we do not observe any clear correlation of the ignition time with either the bulk velocity or the laminar flame speed, which is related to the equivalence ratio. This is in contrast to previous works performed in pre-mixed annular combustors. In the current setup of a rich-quench-lean RQL mode, the light-around behavior is more similar to that of a non-premixed combustor. Aside from the light-around time, we are also interested in looking at the light-around sequence. An ignition map, as shown on the left, is constructed. To illustrate how it should be interpreted, let us first consider a typical time series of an ignition light-around process. We see that injector 1 is the first to be ignited, as shown by the yellow plot, and then it proceeds sequentially to I6, the black plot. And we can represent this ignition sequence in a schematic as shown on the left. Dark blue represents the first injector to be ignited, which in this case is I1, and dark red is the last, as shown by the color sequence in the color bar over here. The corresponding time taken for ignition is indicated with a black stamp plot as seen over here. The dotted line is the mean light-around time for the particular operating condition. So, for instance, if for that run the ignition takes longer than average, the black circle lies to the right of the dotted line, as it is the case over here. And if the run is faster than usual, the black circle is plotted to the left of the dotted line. And we can repeat this for the next 9 runs, which we have sorted in descending ignition time. And this gives us the ignition map, which provides us with a qualitative overview of the ignition sequence across all runs, along with the associated light-around time of each run. And with this, we proceed to make a comparison between the different cases. So for the same operating condition, that is the same injector velocity and the same global equivalence ratio, we have on our left the ignition map for the angled injectors, and on our right the ignition map for the straight axial injectors. We notice that the angled injectors produced a more deterministic ignition sequence with a preferred direction compared to the standard straight injector configuration. So for I1, ignition almost always happens at I1 first and then ends at I6. This is due to the strong bulk swirl forcing a preferred direction for light-around. So this leads to less stochastic behavior in the ignition sequence. This is in comparison to the standard annular combustor, which usually sees ignition proceed in 2 branches. An anti-clockwise flame branch, indicated by the black arrow, and a clockwise branch, indicated by the red arrow, before meeting at approximately 180 degrees from the spark location. Next, we consider how the bulk velocity may also affect the flame propagation direction by comparing case A1 and case C1. In this sequence of images, we see that at a velocity of 34 meters per second for case A1, we have an exclusively anti-clockwise flame propagation, which is unsurprising given that that is the direction of the bulk azimuthal swirl. And in the case of case C1, we see that there is a clockwise flame branch as well, indicated by the red arrow, and this does not just happen on a single occasion. If we look at the ignition map for case C1 on the right, we see that the majority of the runs actually has a clockwise flame branch, since the sector I6 is ignited before the sector I5, as shown in the figure. And this is despite the fact that the azimuthal component in C1 is nowhere negligible. The branched sequence did not seem to affect the light around time, however, since in both cases, A1 and C1, the average tau ignition is similar. And in summary, we could say that the bulk azimuthal swirl results in a preferred and hence more deterministic ignition sequence. In the case of a weaker or the lack of an azimuthal swirl, the ignition sequence will be non-sequential with the formation of two flame branches in opposing directions. In any case, the order of ignition does not seem to impact the light around time. Now, in the second part of the presentation, we will be discussing the impact of azimuthal staging on ignition dynamics. Two different azimuthal staging configurations are considered. In AS1 on the left, we have a different fuel mass flow rate for each half of the annulus. Hence, the top and bottom half of the injectors have different color codes, blue and white. In AS2 on the right, two different fuel flow rates are alternated with every second injector. Over here, we have a table summarizing some of the operating conditions we have considered. Generally, the probability of ignition, P ignition, decreases and the light around time, tau ignition, increases with a lower global equivalence ratio. As we can see in the table here, whereby for each staged configuration, the cases are sorted in decreasing global equivalence ratio. We also note that depending on the staged configuration, the lean ignition limit may be extended considerably. For instance, when employing AS1 staging, we are able to achieve a lean ignition limit at a global equivalence ratio of 0.5. In the case of AS2 with an alternating injector layout, the lean ignition limit is at 0.52. This means that the placement of stage injectors is crucial to the lean ignition limit. One reason why the placement of stage injectors is important may be attributed to the piloting effect present in this current novel injector configuration. So over here is a video which illustrates the piloting effect and how an injector may help to ignite, or in this case, reignite the subsequent injectors. Here, we have injectors 1, 2, and 6, which are reach and denoted in blue with the letter R, while injectors 3, 4, and 5 are lean and denoted in white. I just want to emphasize here that when we mean reach and lean injectors, it is a relative thing. In this case, the lean injectors do indeed have equivalence ratio less than 1. But generally speaking, in staging, the lean injectors are simply leaner than the others and can still be fuel rich with equivalence ratio more than 1. So we see that at the beginning of this video, all injectors have been successfully ignited. At some point, however, injector 4 starts to blow off, and likewise for the subsequent injector, injector 5, as we can see from the circled region in red. However, we can infer from this video that the long jet flame from injector 3 propagates and ejects hot combustion products right into the region of injector 4, and is very likely the reason of reignition in injector 4. as we'll see now. After the successful reignition of injector 4, we'll see that injector 5 gets reignited as well. And eventually, the flame on these injectors will eventually stabilize. So here are some image instances of interest which show the instance of blow-off and subsequent reignition more clearly. Aside from the piloting effects, we also observed that in a staged configuration, the flame kernel may travel along the chamber via propagation and advection to ignite injectors that are located further from the igniter first. This has also been observed in unstaged cases and in the AS1 staged case. But in the AS2 configuration, the occurrence is much more frequent, and this video illustrates that. So for here, we have alternating injectors 1, 3, and 5. They are in blue, and they are richer than injectors 2, 4, and 6 in white. In this case, the flame kernel travels 2 injector positions away from the spark location before successfully igniting injector 3, as we will see from this video. So the corresponding image instance are shown here, with the flame propagation circuit in red. A plausible explanation is that in a staged configuration, especially in the RQL mode, there are pockets of fuel rich and fuel lean zones. So the flame kernel grows and propagates only when the local zone is successfully fuel rich. So in the case of AS2, it seems that the flame kernel tends to travel a longer distance before successfully growing and propagating. So there is a higher likelihood of being quenched, which may explain the slightly worse ignition limit compared to the AS1 configuration. A more detailed parametric studies could be conducted to help validate any hypothesis we may have, but we could conclude that the mass flow splits from the staged injectors, dilution ports, and effusion-cooled backplane control the fuel-air mixing and therefore the local equivalence ratio, which influences the eventual lean ignition limit. Strategic placement of richer injectors in a staged configuration could therefore be made to good use to increase the likelihood of a successful ignition and improve the ignition limits. And this brings us to potential work that we could perform. A mixture fraction measurement could be useful in identifying the spatial and temporal distribution of the fuel-air mixture, allowing us to compute, for instance, the Takeno flame index, or verify the role of mixing timescales and the local equivalence ratios, which may help better explain on the correlation with the characteristic light around time and the flame behavior observed during staged ignition. This could be done either experimentally or with the help of large eddy simulation, LES. In fact, LES has already been performed by Surfax on selected cases, but data has not been compared with the experimental result yet. Emission studies could also be performed to gauge the effectiveness of the RQL combustion mode, to evaluate whether a low NOx route has indeed been realized. And lastly, based on our understanding, our current study has been one of the slightly more comprehensive ones at present in terms of gathering statistics for the light around time for the same operating point. But it may be possible that statistical convergence has not yet been achieved. So a logical step would be to gather more data so that we are confident of a statistical convergence. And these are just some of the many references which have helped us in our current work. Finally, to conclude, this work could not have been possible without the funding support from the European Union, our industrial partner Safran Helicopter Engine, and academic partner Safex. We would also like to thank Dr. Daniel de Hoogs from Liquid Tapahi for his guidance on the spark ignition, and last but definitely not least, Dr. Samuel Weisman from NTNU for his laboratory assistance. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you.